The cozy suburban house was alight with festive cheer. Strings of twinkling lights adorned the eaves, and the scent of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air. Mark had gone all out this year, determined to make New Year's unforgettable for his wife, Olivia, and their two young children, Emily and Ben. Mark's pièce de résistance was a professional Santa Claus he'd hired to visit the kids on New Year's Eve. Roger came highly recommended, a charismatic performer known for his lifelike costume and ability to enchant children and adults alike. The night of the visit, Mark could barely contain his excitement as he ushered Roger into their living room. Dressed in a plush red suit with golden embroidery and sporting a perfectly styled white beard, Roger looked every bit the part. "Ho, ho, ho! Merry New Year's Eve!" Roger boomed, his voice deep and warm. Emily and Ben gasped, their eyes wide with wonder as Santa handed out small presents and told stories of the North Pole. Olivia stood nearby, watching with a smile that seemed different. Her eyes lingered on Roger a little longer than Mark expected, but he brushed it off as her enjoying the holiday spirit. After Roger left, the family settled in for a cozy evening by the fire. Mark felt a warm glow of satisfaction as Emily and Ben fell asleep clutching their gifts, their faces lit with joy. "You really outdid yourself," Olivia said, her voice soft as she leaned over to kiss Mark's cheek. "Anything for you and the kids," Mark replied, his heart swelling with love. But later that night, as the family slept, the quiet hum of the neighborhood was disturbed. A shadow moved across the snow-dusted lawn, slipping silently onto the balcony of Mark and Olivia's bedroom. Roger, still in his Santa suit, climbed through the sliding glass door Olivia had left unlocked. "You're late," Olivia whispered, her tone playful as she greeted him in the dim light of the room. Roger chuckled, pulling off his beard. "Had to make sure the coast was clear." Their laughter was muffled as they disappeared into the shadows of the room. The next morning, Mark woke early to the sound of his children's excited voices. Olivia was already up, bustling around the kitchen and humming to herself. She seemed more energetic than usual, her cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkling. "You're in a good mood," Mark remarked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Olivia shrugged, her smile coy. "It's the holidays. It's hard not to be." Mark smiled, unaware of the double meaning in her words. That evening, Emily and Ben couldn't stop talking about Santa. "He was so funny," Ben exclaimed. "I wish he could come back." "Maybe he will next year," Mark said, ruffling his son's hair. As the kids chattered away, Olivia excused herself to check something upstairs. Mark barely noticed her absence, engrossed in a board game with the kids. Upstairs, Olivia was standing on the balcony, her heart racing as she scanned the yard below. Roger emerged from the shadows, his Santa suit swapped for casual clothes, but the mischievous glint in his eyes was unmistakable. "You know, sneaking around is part of the fun," Roger said, climbing onto the balcony with practiced ease. Olivia smirked. "You're incorrigible." Roger leaned in closer. "And you love it." Their whispered conversation was cut short by the sound of Mark's voice calling Olivia's name. Roger pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, before slipping back into the shadows. As the days passed, Mark noticed subtle changes in Olivia. She seemed more preoccupied, her laughter softer and more private. But she was also more affectionate, as if overcompensating for something. Mark dismissed his doubts, attributing her behavior to holiday stress and the effort of entertaining the kids. The children, however, noticed something else entirely. One night, as Mark tucked Ben into bed, his son asked a question that made his heart skip a beat. "Dad, why does Santa come back at night?" Ben asked, his voice small. Mark froze. "What do you mean?" "I hear him on the balcony sometimes," Ben said. "He talks to Mom." Mark's stomach twisted, but he forced a laugh. "You must have been dreaming, buddy. Santa only visits once a year." Ben nodded sleepily, but Mark couldn't shake the unease that settled over him. As he returned to the living room, he found Olivia on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a serene expression. "Everything okay?" she asked, looking up. "Yeah," Mark said, his voice distant. "Just tired." But as he watched Olivia's face, the seed of doubt planted by Ben's words began to grow. He told himself it was nothing, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The holiday cheer around the house showed no signs of waning, but Mark couldn't shake the unease lingering in the back of his mind. Ben's innocent remark about hearing Santa on the balcony replayed in his thoughts. Mark tried to rationalize it, chalking it up to a child's imagination. Still, he found himself glancing at the balcony more often than usual. Olivia's behavior had shifted subtly, but enough for Mark to notice. She seemed more vibrant, her smiles almost too bright, her jokes landing a little too perfectly. She was, in Mark's eyes, trying too hard. It wasn't just the little things, there was something about her energy that felt misplaced, like her thoughts were elsewhere. One evening, as Mark returned from taking out the trash, their neighbor Carol called out to him from her porch. "Mark, I've been meaning to ask," Carol said, wrapping her shawl tightly against the cold. "Is everything all right at your place?" Mark frowned, confused. "Of course. Why do you ask?" Carol hesitated. "I thought I saw someone on your balcony last night. It looked like a man. I didn't want to pry, but it seemed odd." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "You must have been mistaken," he said, forcing a laugh. "Probably just a shadow." Carol nodded, but her concerned expression lingered. "Maybe. But you know how these older houses creak. Be careful." That night, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Olivia slept soundly beside him. He couldn't shake the image Carol had planted in his mind. Could someone really have been on their balcony? Was Ben telling the truth about hearing Santa? Mark's mind spiraled, but he convinced himself he was being paranoid. Still, he decided to be more observant. The following morning, as the family gathered for breakfast, Mark tried to gauge Olivia's demeanor. She was cheerful, humming a tune as she flipped pancakes for the kids. Emily and Ben giggled, oblivious to the tension Mark felt brewing beneath the surface. "What's on the agenda today?" Mark asked casually, sipping his coffee. Olivia glanced over her shoulder. "I thought I'd take the kids sledding for a bit. Maybe bake some cookies later." "Why?" "No reason," Mark said, studying her expression. "Just curious." She flashed him a warm smile, but Mark couldn't tell if it was genuine or carefully curated. Later that afternoon, while Olivia and the kids were out sledding, Mark decided to check the balcony. He inspected the snow for footprints, his breath visible in the freezing air. Sure enough, faint impressions led to the sliding glass door. Mark's chest tightened as he crouched to examine them. They were larger than Olivia's boots, but too smudged to make out details. Mark went back inside, his mind racing. If someone had been on the balcony, who were they? And why would Olivia leave the door unlocked? He resolved to talk to her about it but hesitated, unsure of how to bring it up without sounding accusatory. That evening, as the family watched a holiday movie, Mark noticed Olivia's phone light up with a notification. She quickly grabbed it, her expression unreadable as she typed a reply. Mark couldn't see the message but felt a twinge of unease. "Work?" he asked, gesturing toward her phone. Olivia hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just a quick update for a client." Mark nodded, though the explanation felt hollow. Olivia rarely worked during the holidays, especially not on family movie night. He decided to let it go for the moment, but made a mental note to keep an eye on her. That night, as the house grew quiet, Mark stayed awake in the living room. He'd left the lights off, wanting to see if anything unusual happened. The balcony door was visible from his seat on the couch, and Mark's eyes darted to it with every creak of the house. Around midnight, just as he was about to give up and head to bed, a shadow crossed the snow outside. Mark's breath caught as he watched a figure climb onto the balcony, moving with practiced ease. The figure knocked softly on the sliding glass door, and Mark's stomach dropped as Olivia appeared from the hallway, opening the door just enough to let the person inside. Mark's mind raced as he strained to make out the intruder. The man's features were obscured, but the red fabric of his coat was unmistakable. It was Roger, the Santa Claus. Mark's grip on the armrest tightened as he watched Olivia and Roger exchange hushed words. Roger pulled off his Santa hat, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Olivia smiled at him, her expression soft and intimate. They disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door behind them. Mark sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. How could Olivia do this? And with a man who had been in their home, entertaining their children. He wanted to burst into the room, to confront them right then and there. But something held him back. Mark decided he needed more than an emotional outburst, he needed proof. The next day, Mark purchased a small security camera and discreetly installed it on the balcony. He didn't tell Olivia, masking his growing frustration with forced smiles and small talk. As he kissed her goodbye that morning, he felt the distance between them grow wider. "I'll be working late tonight," he said, though he had no such plans. "That's fine," Olivia said lightly, her tone too nonchalant. "We'll probably just relax here." Mark nodded, hiding the storm brewing inside him. That night, as he reviewed the camera footage, he braced himself for what he might find. Mark sat in the dim glow of his laptop, staring at the security camera feed. The footage from the balcony was grainy but clear enough to confirm his worst fears. Shortly after midnight, the same shadowy figure appeared, climbing onto the balcony with ease. This time, the camera caught his face. Roger, the Santa Claus Mark had hired for their children, smirked as Olivia let him inside. Mark's hands clenched into fists as he watched them exchange hushed words. Olivia led Roger toward the bedroom, glancing back over her shoulder. The door shut, leaving Mark to grapple with the betrayal unfolding before his eyes. The next morning, Mark felt like he was moving through a fog. Olivia greeted him cheerfully, her behavior a stark contrast to the truth Mark now knew. She hummed while preparing breakfast, her actions so normal that Mark almost doubted what he had seen. "You're quiet today," Olivia remarked, handing him a cup of coffee. "Just tired," Mark replied, forcing a smile. "Long night." Olivia's eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps. But the moment passed quickly, and she returned to her cheerful facade. Mark's stomach churned. He needed to confront her, but not yet. First, he wanted to confront Roger. That afternoon, Mark called Roger under the pretense of discussing another visit for the children. Roger's tone was as confident and charismatic as ever. "Of course, Mark," Roger said. "Anything for the kids. They loved Santa." "Great," Mark replied, his voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "How about we meet this evening to discuss the details?" "Sure thing," Roger said, clearly unsuspecting. Mark hung up, his jaw tight. The plan was in motion. That evening, Mark met Roger at a coffee shop near the house. Roger arrived in casual clothes, a far cry from the jolly Santa persona he had donned just days before. "Mark!" Roger greeted warmly, extending a hand. "What's on your mind?" Mark shook his hand, his grip firm. "Just wanted to discuss the next visit." The kids were really impressed. Roger grinned. "I aim to please." Mark leaned forward, his voice low. "Do you aim to please my wife, too?" Roger's smile faltered, his eyes widening slightly. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Mark snapped, his calm veneer cracking. "I know you've been sneaking into my house at night. I've got the footage." Roger's expression shifted from surprise to a calculated coolness. "Look, Mark, I think you're misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Mark hissed. "I watched you climb onto my balcony, Roger. I saw you with Olivia." Roger sighed, leaning back in his chair. "All right, you caught me. But if you're here to throw a punch, you're wasting your time. This, whatever you think it is, it's not serious." Mark's fists tightened. "Not serious?" "You've been sneaking into my house, betraying my trust, and jeopardizing my family. That's pretty damn serious to me." Roger shrugged, his nonchalance infuriating. Look, man. It's your call. Do you want to ruin your family over this? Or can we both just walk away? Mark stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're done. If I see you near my house again, you'll regret it. Roger raised his hands in mock surrender, a smirk tugging at his lips. Fair enough. Have it your way, Mark. When Mark returned home, Olivia was in the kitchen, her back to him. She turned, startled, when he entered. You're back early, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Mark crossed his arms, staring at her intently. We need to talk. Olivia's eyes darted to the side, a nervous habit Mark knew all too well. About what? About the man you've been sneaking into our house, Mark said, his voice steady but firm. About Roger. The color drained from Olivia's face. Mark, Don't, Mark interrupted, holding up a hand. I want the truth, Olivia. No more lies. For a moment, she seemed ready to deny it. But as she met Mark's gaze, her shoulders sagged. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, she whispered. It just happened. Mark's chest tightened, anger and sadness warring within him. Do you even realize what you've done? You've broken my trust. You betrayed our family. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Mark. I made a mistake. Mark shook his head, stepping back. A mistake? This wasn't a mistake, Olivia. It was a choice. And now we have to deal with the consequences. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Olivia standing alone, her tears falling silently. The house was quiet after their tense exchange. Olivia remained in the kitchen, tears streaking her face as Mark retreated to the den. He poured himself a drink, the clinking of ice against glass the only sound breaking the silence. His mind raced, replaying the events of the past weeks. The betrayal, the lies, the audacity of Roger, it all came crashing down on him. But this wasn't over. Mark had more to say, and he wasn't going to let Olivia or Roger get away with it so easily. The next morning, Mark woke early. He had barely slept, his thoughts churning with plans for what he needed to do next. Olivia had already left the house, a note on the counter said she was taking the kids to the park. He read the note twice, his jaw tightening. It felt like a cowardly way for her to avoid the inevitable confrontation. Mark grabbed his phone and dialed a number. Carol? It's Mark. Can we talk? You mentioned something about seeing someone on my balcony. I think we need to compare notes. Carol was hesitant at first, but agreed to meet Mark at the coffee shop down the street. Over steaming mugs, she confirmed what he already knew. It was him, wasn't it? Mark asked, his voice low. Carol nodded. I thought it was strange at the time, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. He was wearing that same Santa coat. He didn't even try to hide it. Mark's stomach churned. Roger had been brazen, assuming he could outwit him and remain undetected. By the time Mark returned home, he had formulated a plan. He wasn't going to let this fester in silence any longer. That evening, when Olivia returned with the kids, he confronted her again, this time in the living room where they couldn't avoid each other. We need to talk. Now, Mark said, his voice firm. Olivia's eyes flickered with nervousness. She ushered the kids upstairs, promising them a movie before bedtime. When she returned, Mark was standing by the fireplace, his arms crossed. Mark, I don't know what you want me to say, Olivia began, her voice shaky. I want you to tell me the truth, Mark said, his tone icy. Why him? Why Roger? Olivia hesitated, then sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands wringing together. I don't know. He made me feel noticed. Special. You've been so focused on work, and I just... Mark cut her off. Don't put this on me. I've been working to give you and the kids everything. And this is how you repay me? Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. But I never meant to hurt you. Mark shook his head, pacing the room. You didn't mean to hurt me? You've been sneaking around with a man dressed as Santa Claus. In our house. While our kids are asleep upstairs. How could you think this wouldn't hurt me? Olivia's silence spoke volumes. Finally, she whispered, I'm sorry, Mark. I don't know what else to say. That night, Mark made another call, this time to Roger. He invited him to the house under the pretense of a civil discussion. Roger, perhaps emboldened by Olivia's earlier interactions, agreed without hesitation. When Roger arrived, still dressed in his signature Santa coat, Mark was waiting for him on the front porch. Mark, Roger said, smiling as if nothing was amiss. I wasn't expecting an invite. What's this about? Mark's expression was steely. Let's take this inside. As they stepped into the living room, Olivia appeared, her face pale. Her eyes widened when she saw Roger, and she shot Mark a panicked look. What's going on? She asked, her voice trembling. We're settling this, Mark said. Right here. Right now. Roger's confident demeanor faltered. Look, Mark, I think we... Mark raised a hand to silence him. No. You've done enough talking. It's time for you to listen. He turned to Olivia. Do you love him? Olivia's face crumpled. No. It wasn't about that. It was stupid and meaningless. Meaningless? Mark repeated, his voice rising. You risked everything we've built for something meaningless? Roger tried to interject, but Mark cut him off. And you? You came into my home, into my family's life, and thought you could get away with this? Roger raised his hands defensively. Look, Save it, Mark snapped. I'm done listening to excuses. You're going to leave and never come near my family again. If you do, you'll regret it. Roger opened his mouth as if to argue, but seemed to think better of it. He turned and left without another word, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing through the house. Mark stood in the living room, his chest heaving as the adrenaline coursed through him. Olivia sat on the couch, silent and trembling. I don't know what happens next, Mark said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. But things are going to change. Starting now. He turned and walked upstairs, leaving Olivia alone to face the consequences of her choices. The days following the confrontation were eerily quiet. Mark and Olivia barely spoke, their conversations limited to logistical matters concerning the kids. The once vibrant holiday spirit that had filled their home was gone, replaced by an unbearable tension. Mark threw himself into work, finding solace in the familiar structure of his job. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Olivia's words over and over. It wasn't about love. It was meaningless. How could she say that when her actions had nearly destroyed their family? He didn't know if he could forgive her, but the thought of tearing their family apart weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, Olivia struggled with her own guilt. She spent her days trying to regain some semblance of normalcy for the children, but every time she looked at Mark, she saw the pain she had caused etched into his face. She knew an apology wasn't enough, but she didn't know how to begin to fix what she had broken. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Olivia found Mark in the den, nursing a glass of whiskey. She hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. Mark, she began softly. Can we talk? Mark didn't look at her. What's there to talk about? I want to make this right, Olivia said, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Mark finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just betray me. You betrayed us. Our family. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. I know. And I hate myself for it. But I love you, Mark. I love our family. Please, give me a chance to prove that to you. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But for the kids, I'm willing to try. On one condition. Anything, Olivia said quickly. We go to counseling, Mark said firmly. If we're going to fix this, we need help. Olivia nodded, relief washing over her. I'll set it up tomorrow. The first counseling session was difficult. Mark aired his grievances, his voice shaking with anger and pain as he recounted how he had felt neglected, betrayed, and humiliated. Olivia listened, tears streaming down her face, as the counselor guided them through the process of addressing their feelings. Over time, the sessions became less about the affair and more about rebuilding their relationship. Mark learned to express his emotions more openly, and Olivia worked on earning back his trust. It wasn't easy, but both of them were committed to the process. As for Roger, he didn't escape unscathed. Word of his actions spread quickly through the community, thanks to Mark's decision to warn others about the so-called Santa for hire. Roger's reputation was ruined, and he left town shortly afterward, disappearing without a trace. Months later, Mark and Olivia sat on the couch, watching the kids play a board game on the floor. The tension between them had eased, though the scars of the past remained. Mark reached for Olivia's hand, squeezing it gently. We've come a long way, he said quietly. Olivia nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. I'll never stop making it up to you. Mark gave her a small, sad smile. Let's just take it one day at a time. Their marriage wasn't the same, and it never would be. But as they worked to rebuild what had been broken, they found a new appreciation for the fragility of trust and the strength it took to repair it. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, they faced it together.